Welcome to the British Library. It's the home of words and people who love them. I'm Bea Rolat and I work in the cultural events team, and it's my massive delight to welcome you all to the opening lecture of our buzzing new exhibition, Medieval Women in Their Own Words. And it's that last part that makes it so exciting. A couple of the curators are actually in the house tonight. Ellie and Callum, where are you? Natasha, here, so that you know. And you have to visit this exhibition, not least to find out whether you passed the witch test. Has anyone been in? Can I have a show of hands? Yeah. Oh, loads of you. So who's the witch? Excellent, thank you. There's witches in the house. We're all good to go. An extra welcome to our online audience. I hope there's loads of witches out there too. Don't forget, you can put your questions in the box because we will be coming to Q&A later. But first, for the first part of the evening, I'm delighted to welcome back the brilliant Kate Arnold. Kate is classically trained on violin and vocals. She's currently doing a PhD on medieval French and Arabic lyrics. Tonight is all about her hammered dulcimer, though, and you will find her electro-medievalist album, Rota Fortunae, on sale afterwards. Please welcome back Kate Arnold.
At chantar merdes occhio novoria Tamir ancor de lui qui soia mia Cariola mais que noia renquesia Vas lui non val merces ni cortesia Ni mareltas, ni mustres Catres in soi agnana de traia Cum de gresse issio fos desavines Biotats et plus vos fins corages, percio vos mal, laiones vostres stages, esta chanson que me sia messages. E voi saber lo mios bels amics, perché vos n'ets tan bels, ni tan salvages, no sei si sei sorgois o mal talents. Aitan plus voili dias messages. Centro d'orgoll an grand an mein tas gens. Thank you. And thank you to the Contessa Beatriz de Dia, who wrote that song in something like 1180. Some of you may already know that that song is the only song by a troubadourette. This is the female troubadours of southern France. The only one by a female troubadour that still has a melody attached. And that was the melody that I was singing. And that song is actually in the exhibition as well, in a different version with some text. So do make sure you go and have a look at that. You may want to know what it was about. It's all about being ghosted by her lover. And she finishes by saying, I also should remind you that too much pride has been the downfall of many a man. I'm going to sing something in Arabic now. This is attributed to a woman called Maysoon bint Bahdal, although it may be by a different Maysoon bint Jandal, and we think it's from the 8th century. It's talking about a common experience among women at that time across the world, and that is the experience of being sent to a foreign country, far away from home, to marry a complete stranger in order to cement a political alliance. And in this case, Maysoon was sent to marry the Caliph. So in this song, she is talking about some of the things that she misses from her homeland. A house in which souls or spirits throb and flutter is dearer to me than a lofty palace. Eating breadcrumbs in a nook of my house is dearer to me than eating a whole loaf in a palace. And the sounds of the wind in all its intensity are more beloved to me than the beating of tambourines. The roughness of my life in the desert is more desirable to my spirit than this life of luxury. لبيت تخفق الأرواح فيه أحب إلي من قصر منيف وكلب ينبح التراق عني أحب إلي من قط ألوف لأمرد من شبابي بني كلابا أحب إلي من شيخ نظيفا ولبس عباءة وتقر عيني أحب إلي من لبس الشفوف وأكل كسيرة في كسر بيتي أحب إلي من أكل الرغيف وأصوات الرياح بكل فج أحب إلي من نقر الدفوف وبكر يتبع الأذعان صعب أحب إلي من بعل صفوف وخرق من بني عمي نحيفا أحب إلي من علج عنيف خشونة عيشتي في البدو أشهى إلى نفسي من العيش الظريف فما أبغي سوى وطني بديلا فحسب ذاك من وطن شريف. Thank you.
Kate Arnold's CDs will be on sale afterwards. Now, I don't like it when they say she needs no introduction. I just don't agree. But I do need to take a deep breath before embarking on this one, so bear with me. She is, of course, the Kate Mosse, and since joining the board of the British Library, she's now our Kate Mosse. And she has spent an unusual amount of time in the 15 and 1600s with the Joubert Family Chronicles. So in exploring medieval women, who better than one of the finest storytellers to take us inside those lives? Kate is someone whose work shows and tells us that women's voices matter, and that women's voices have always been there. She is a prolific, award-winning, globally best-selling writer of fiction and non-fiction, and she's signing books after the event. I must also mention that next year she's touring her best-selling novel as a one-woman theatre show, Labyrinth Live, and she also has a book delivering feminist history for every day of the year, coming out in October. I cannot wait. She's the founder, I warned you, she's the founder of the Women's Prize. She wrote the introduction to this stunning book, which accompanies the Medieval Women exhibition, which has flat sold out. There's no copies left, but you can order it on a QR code, and I recommend that you do. If all of this wasn't enough, even her shoes recently made national headlines. You'll see why in a minute. It's so good to have you here, Kate. Give it up for Kate Mosse. Woohoo! Cheers. Enjoy.
Thank you, Bea. How wonderful to see so many of you here to celebrate medieval women here and now. Now, Bea asked you, I think many of you have already been in, and many of you, I'm sure, will be going in. For me, this exhibition is extremely special and timely. And in a way, it comes back to a question that I've been asking myself since I was at school. I loved school. I enjoyed almost all the subjects, not physics and maths, but all the other subjects. And it was only after a while that I started to notice that we were missing. Girls and women were missing. So you would go into a history lesson and you would learn about generals and kings and queens and occasionally and religious leaders. But it didn't look like the world that I inhabited. And you would go into English and you would be studying Jane Austen, absolutely. But the rest of it was Shakespeare and Pope and Dickens. And then you'd go into music and you'd been told that there weren't really any women composers at all. If I had a quid for every time somebody said to me there are no women classical composers, I would be a very wealthy woman, as well as being a very tired woman. But it started a train of thought about this. What is history? Who decides who matters and who doesn't? Who decides what is written about, what is relevant, and what isn't? And if history is only a partial bit of the story, what purpose is it really serving? And all of these thoughts were going round in my mind, I suppose, when I was much younger, not consciously, because it's hard to notice absence. But once you notice absence, you cannot unsee it. And then something else happened. And this was, and you can see the window there, was going to a place called Carcassonne in 1989. And we were only there by accident, my husband and I, in that we wanted a little bolt hole in France, and my husband had lived in France, and he was an interpreter and a translator. And my wonderful mother-in-law, Granny Rosie, she had a friend who had a friend who had a friend who was an estate agent, twinned with an estate agent in a place called Carcassonne, in a place called Languedoc. And everything that has happened in my writing career has come from that moment of serendipity. And you can imagine, ladies and gentlemen, I have often thought over the past few years, what would have happened if she had been twinned with an estate agent in Bognor Regis? Would I have written anything at all? Although, actually, I should add at this moment that Bognor Regis is the only town in England named after a Saxon saint who is a woman. So, you know, there is some distinction there. But we arrived there in November 1989. And these were the days before aeroplanes flew into Carcassonne. So we'd come on the train, and we got off the train, and we walked through the modern town, which is 14th century. And any of you who know France will know that there's something that happens at about 7:01, out of season, and that is that everybody vanishes. So we walked through an almost deserted town, hearing every now and again footsteps somewhere in the mist. And then we arrived at the Pont Vieux, the old bridge, that separates the Bastide, the 14th century town, from the medieval citadel, which is actually built on Roman gallo remains. And I saw for the first time La Cité of Carcassonne. 52 towers and turrets, 2 rings of walls. It was like a crown of stone sitting on the hill. And it was a coup de foudre, really. You know, I fell in love instantly. And it wasn't just a sense of this place is magnificent, but it was a sense of, oh, I belong here. And over the next few years, I didn't intend to write about it, but over the next few years, because this is what you do when you fall in love, I read everything I could about the history of the region, and in particular, a group of so-called heretical Christians called the Cathars, who had lived and been persecuted and died in that part of France in the 11th, 12th, 13th, and early 14th centuries. And out of that came a sense of what I call, for me, the whispering in the landscape. The idea that here, in this place, there was a story for me. And as I read more and more, and any of you who have gone to France and read any guidebooks, you will know that there is a great tradition in France of guidebooks being translated by people who don't really speak English. So I had to go a little bit deeper in the actual history of the Cathars and what it really meant, and started to go into the archives, and there are extraordinary resources there. And what I discovered chimed with the sense that I had had as a girl at school in Sussex in the late 1960s and the early 1970s. That, if you like, there was a bigger history that I had not known about, that here was suddenly laid out in Carcassonne and the story of the Cathars. Because within Catharism, and one must be very, very careful not to glamorize this or simplify it, but I am interested in stories of faith and the consequences of faith, and of course war and the consequences of war. And as we all know, religious war is never really about faith. It's about power and land and influence and status. But to discover within this group of so-called heretical Christians, there had been, in 1209 and before and after, female priests in Christianity in Europe, was a piece of information that I had never known. And I thought about everything I'd been told about the pattern of Christianity and thought, well, that's interesting. This part of the story was never told. And I didn't intend to write a novel. But finally, looking up from my window to the medieval citadel, I went to the place where it wasn't the end of Catharism, but it was a place called Mosse CBE, the safe mountain in the Pyrenees, where in 1244, after 8 months of siege, finally the Cathars surrendered to the Catholic troops and the northern French kings, because this was a war really of occupation. And there were many other falls of citadels that went after that. And the last Cathar parfait, the priest Guillaume Bellibaste, was executed much later on. And it's what the great French historian Anne Brenon calls the whisper of Catharism. But in terms of the loss of the independence of the South, it happened then, really, in 1244. And I now, looking back, can see that I put off going there because I didn't want there to be any lack of spirit of place. I didn't want it to be a place simply of plastic swords and ice creams and tickets sold at the entrance to the mountain. But I finally went there, and I left my family down below, building a snowman close to the memorial to the Cathar martyrs that was only put up in the 60s. And it commemorated the maybe 200 people of 400 that were burnt there on the 16th of August, 1244. And I walked on my own up to the top of the mountain. And it was cold, and it was snowing. It was very much the time of year that the citadel surrendered and fell. But suddenly, I walked up through the cloud cover. And those of you who've been to that part of France will know that intense blue of the midi sky. And the sun was this great white ball above the Pyrenees, and everything was glittering. And I carried on walking up, and I got to the citadel. It's not the castle that was there then, but it's built on the footprint. And there is something that is less so now, but very much back in the day in France. France doesn't really do health and safety in quite the way we do. Their view is if you climb on a wall in the ice and you fall off and die, it is your own fault. You should not have gone on the wall, which meant that I climbed up on the wall on my own and stood looking out. And I thought two things. First was, what would it have felt like at dawn on the 16th of March, 1244, to stand on this wall and see the incredible beauty of the Pyrenees and the villages all around, and then to look down and see an enormous pyre, bigger than this theatre, being built for you and the faggots being lit, and listen to the Catholic troops and the priests singing their song of their crusade, and know that within a matter of hours, most of the people that you loved would die, and die terribly. And then I suddenly imagined a woman in a red cloak pulling it around herself and turning away and walking down. And then I thought nothing more about it. But 10 years later, when I came to write the chapter in the novel that became Labyrinth, I was typing about my lead character, Alaïs, pulled her red cloak around herself, and I thought, oh, it's you. I met you 10 years ago on the wall, and I didn't know who you were. And that, ladies, gentlemen, and witches, is how fiction works. But None of us would be able to write these things without the source material and without the brilliant historians who do the work. And there are some wonderful historians here this evening, the fantastic curators, Ellie and Callum, who are here. I can see Jonathan Phillips, who is the leader in this field, I would say, and Natasha Hodgson, who's written a brilliant couple of essays in the book about Crusader women, is also here. But for those of us who are inspired by the works of history and the voices from history, the idea that we are walking in the footsteps of people of the past, this exhibition is for you. And it's already only been opened a few days, and it's had 5-star reviews all over the place, not least of all from The Telegraph, who says this dazzling new show does away with the stereotypes of pre-Renaissance women and shows off the full glorious spread of medieval life. Because this is the point, that every little bit of history we've told, there is a shadow behind it. There is a light that needs to be shone more widely. And women writing in their own words, regretfully, is as important now as it was in the period of which this extraordinary exhibition celebrates, from 1100 to 1500. Now, most of you have been in or will go in, and you will have your favourites. With my friend sitting down there, she was telling me the things that she would have picked out. And I've picked out a few that means something to me, and I think means something more broadly to all of us who are interested in women's voices, how we protect them, how we amplify them, how we put women back into history. And let's be clear, this is not taking out of history beautiful, brilliant, wonderful men. It's simply putting women back where we always were. Because if history is not the story of all of us, it isn't really history at all. And it matters because history is used to justify what is happening now. So we must know where we came from and the full story of everybody who made it. And when you start to ask that question, what is history? You learn this, that in the day that people are writing about, women were there, but it was the writing of history that left them out. So you will have been in or are about to go in, and you will come across a couple of treasures. You will discover not just manuscripts and books, but objects and interactive things. There is a fantastic thing. There are female mystics. The exhibition is divided into 3 parts: private lives, public lives, and spiritual lives. And there is a great deal of wit and humour within the exhibition as well. Take time to read the labels, because they are very, very funny. When you get to, a treatise about how to marry, and you see that it's called Put a Ring on It. And I think there are modern singers who would be very impressed by that. But there are, for example, the gold coin of Sharjah el-Dur, the first female sultan of Egypt. There is the testimony of the sex worker Eleanor Rykener, who was brought before the court by the Mayor of London in 1395. And she, in modern terms, we would say, is possibly one of the first transgender women to have been written about and to have told some of her own story. There is a primer for a girl learning to read, written in Middle Dutch and Latin, and a picture of girls in a classroom with a female teacher at a time that we are told that girls were not taught to read. There is one of my favourites, the skull of a Barbary lion, possibly belonging to Margaret of Anjou around 1420 to 1480. But in the accounts book of Margaret of Anjou, the book does record payment for the upkeep of a lion. So I am convinced that that might be the real one. But what I have done is just picked out a few highlights for me, and you will have your own, and maybe you will agree, and maybe you will be howling at me when we do the questions for the things that I missed. So the first one is the Melisande Psalter. She is an extraordinary queen of Jerusalem. She's often called the Queen of Jerusalem. She lived from 1105 to 1161. And one of the reasons, and I am not a historian, I'm a novelist, but I've always felt that one of the reasons that Melisande is not better known is because when she was in charge, it was peaceful. There weren't so many wars. And she's kind of slightly gone under the radar. Now, she had a French Crusader father and an Armenian mother. And her father, Baldwin II, became king of Jerusalem in 1118. But he was preparing her all the way through to be his heir. He didn't put aside his wife when he had 4 daughters and marry somebody else to get a son. Instead, you start to see Melisendre's name appear on documents alongside. And Fulk of Anjou was chosen as her husband in 1129, but he stipulated on his death that Fulk, Melisendre, and their infant son, Baldwin, he'll become Baldwin III, should inherit together. Now, Fulk, who had come from Europe and maybe had a slightly less egalitarian frame of mind, shall we say, the minute that poor old Baldwin was in the grave, decided that he wasn't going to do this and he wasn't going to rule with her. And so he started to kind of essentially run things on his own. And the Lords of Outremer, as it's called, the Holy Land, objected to this, and Melisendre objected to this. And so there is a period of war between them, essentially, and arguing between them. Now, the reason the Melisande Psalter is so important, it is one of the very few things that we know belong to her. There is very little to evidence personal things that you can evidence, because although she was an enormous patron of the arts, she supported many things. She built institutions such as the Armenian Cathedral, the convent at Bethany, and all of those things. So they stand testament to her legacy. But at the same time, the personal story of her is slightly missing. But we do have this Psalter. Now, she won, essentially. Even the lords who were inclined to see women as inferior and weak backed her, essentially. So Fulk, in the end, gave in, to use very unhistorical language, and they were reconciled by about 1136. Now, we don't entirely know about this Psalter, whether she commissioned it herself or whether he commissioned it as a way of saying, I'm really sorry that I went to war against you and did not do what your dad asked me to do. But either way, it's in the care of the British Library, and it is one of those manuscripts that I have heard about and read about and written about, and suddenly here it is to be seen. It's marvelous to see these things and know that she held it in her hands. Ivory covers inlaid with turquoise and garnet, illuminations of gold and lapis lazuli, Eastern illustrations, Western text, representing multicultural life in Jerusalem. And this image here, you can see, is the adoration of the Magi and the presentation in the temple. I would talk all night about Melisendre. I won't. It seems to me, and maybe this is the romantic talking, that their reconciliation was genuine. Because when he died in a hunting accident in 1143, she clearly did grieve. And she ruled as a regent for her son, and rather sneakily didn't really want to step down when he came of age. And then she ended up slightly being at war with her son as well. But when I said there were no wars, they were just, domestic disputes, shall we say, ladies and gentlemen. But she continued to be at his side once that was reconciled, and she died in 1161. And William of Tyre, we have quite a lot of information about her from William of Tyre. And he was, a prelate and very much a man of his time. And he really admired her. And he said this after she had died, although it's a slightly backhanded compliment. She was a very wise woman, fully experienced in almost all affairs of state business, who completely triumphed over the handicap of her sex, so that she could take charge of important affairs. Thank you, William. This is just one of the very beautiful objects in the exhibition. As you will have seen, there are many different things that go alongside the manuscripts and the books that are there. And this is the ivory cross of Sibylle of Flanders. Now, she was the stepdaughter of Melisendre. Her father was Fulk. But I've only put this in one because it's such a beautiful object, but because I rather like this story. So she stayed at home when her husband Thierry went off on his first 2 crusading expeditions. But once their son was old enough, she joined him for the 3rd visit. And when she got there, she thought, you know what? I don't really want to go back with Thierry. I don't actually really want to be a mother anymore. So she stayed in the Holy Land and became a nun. And she went to the convent of St. Lazarus of Bethany, which of course was founded by Melisande, where her younger sister Yvetta was the abbess, and she died there in 1165. But it's beautiful if you haven't seen it. Now, the mortuary role of Lucy Headingham is next, and this comes from Essex, somewhere between 1225 and 1230. And this was one of those that when I was being shown around the exhibition, it was something new to me. And it just reminded me, that the talk tonight is called Medieval Women Here and Now. And this is one of those things that you could always imagine growing up in the 60s. Anybody who is of my age and who is a girl will have got caught up in chain letters, where somebody writes something and then passes it on and passes it on. This, in a weird sort of way, is a medieval chain letter. So a mortuary roll commemorates the most significant members of religious communities, and it usually was composed of an encyclical or a covering letter which eulogizes the person who is being remembered and requests prayers for their souls. And then messengers would take the roll to other institutions who would add their Latin prayers and their thoughts and memorials and reflections. And I just love the idea of this being sent on, and the miracle that this has survived. Isn't that incredible that it has survived all of these years? So this one is almost 6 meters long, and if you've been into the exhibition, you will see that they've managed to get it in there, and has about 10 parchment membranes. And the opening panel, you can see this here, the top has the crucifixion alongside a seated Virgin and Child, and the priory at Headingham was dedicated to St. Mary and the Holy Cross. In the middle, it's angels carrying Lucy's soul to heaven. She is, Lucy was the abbess. And then the bottom one is her funeral. You can see her body on the bier. And the encyclical letter is just really touching. It was written by her successor as prioress, Agnes, who gives an account of her virtues. And they are what you'd expect, I suppose: piety, abstinence, self-discipline and virginity, but also her sister's grief at her death. It says, a storm of tears and a flood of lamentation. And then beneath it, there are 122 religious houses in East Anglia and southern England who put their reflections. And of course, the further on it goes, they're mostly people who never met Lucy. But I love the idea that it goes on this sort of grand tour around East Anglia and the south of England. And then finally, we're not quite sure when it gets back, but it goes back to Castle Headingham Priory. And that is the mortuary roll, and a wonderful story. And just imagine, any of you who are also novelists in the audience, that's a novel waiting to be written, isn't it? Now, you know that there has always been a sense that bodies are bodies. But what this has always meant is, let's use a male body as the basis, and then we'll add bits on if it's a woman. What we all also know, the ladies amongst us in the audience particularly, that there are particular things that are rather specific to women. And even in the 21st century, Caroline Criado Perez, in her wonderful book, Invisible Women, had proved all the data that still so much of pathology and so much of medical analysis and treatment has been worked ignoring the differences between male and female anatomies. So I couldn't resist anatomical disease woman, because I think that betrays a slight attitude of mind. We know, and this is also in the exhibition, the trotula, which is one of the great cores of women's medical knowledge and treatment of medical issues, written by Trotta of Salerno in Italy. We know for sure that the first part of the three was written by her. The others might have been written by men, actually. We're not quite sure. And it's a Latin compendium. Salerno is in southern Italy. And we think it was written to the early to the middle 12th century. And there were many schools of medicine, and we know that there were many women acting as physicians, particularly in Italy. Now, this book, the Trotula, was circulated all over Europe, and it was the standard medical textbook, if you like, and it was very powerful in England and Normandy, translations into French, Italian, Hebrew, obviously English, German, Irish, and Dutch. We also know that a Persian physician, Mansour, earlier had also composed a textbook for treating women that had an image of a pregnant woman, and this was about 1386. But these are exceptions. Almost all medieval anatomical diagrams are of men, and this is part of the idea that a female body actually, the male body represents the epitome of human health, and a female body is aberrant, if you like, the other side. So this particular one, that is a woman and is a pregnant woman, is rare. And we think the manuscript was made in Germany at about 1420, and it's known as, I rather like this, the Welcome Apocalypse. What I also love, if you can see on the screen, is that there is this is a naked woman. You can see the womb, you can see the fetus, and it's clearly a textbook. You can see all the writing around it. But even so, her hair is veiled. So the idea that there is still a certain amount of modesty that is expected to be shown. And it's incredibly important to see it. And if you have time, just look very closely at everything around the sides and just think of how extraordinary that would be for half of the human population to have their medical needs not met because they were not seen as part of the healthy body. Keeping with pregnancy and women's bodies, the birth girdle. Now, I had never come across a birth girdle, never seen a birth girdle before. This one is from the 15th century and it's English, and about 9 medieval birth girdles survive, so far as we know, of course. And it's a long, thin roll, about 1 metre long, and it's only about 10 centimetres wide. And it's just a beautiful object. Prayers and illustrations which are intended to protect the user, offering assistance against hazards which might include poisoning, fire, battle, wicked spirits, fevers, pestilence. But touch was the key to using the birth girdle. And what is wonderful is you can see here that there are 2 different images. One I've just come in closer. So the one, the bigger image, this is Christ's side wound. And you can just see, if you look, that the middle is rather worn away. And this is because of generations of women touching that for luck. And you can see it on the actual girdle. And above that, these are the 3 nails from the crucifixion. And the curator, Ellie Jackson, told me that they had done testing on this and discovered all range of rather unpleasant fluids, suggesting that this birth girdle had been used a lot by a lot of women. And of course, this is all part of the way that Christianity quite often punishes women. You know, we'll come on to the importance of Christianity for many women, and of course faiths or other faiths for women in a moment. But at the same time, there is still the idea that, you know, the Garden of Eden, the fall, and the idea that Mary felt no pain during childbirth. Therefore, if all other women are feeling pain in childbirth, it is because we are fallen or failed. So says somebody who has never given birth, I would suggest. But very close to the beginning, it has this wonderful thing. It says, if a woman be travelling of child, that means to be pregnant and be in childbirth, lay this or set this on her. And churches often kept hold of these birth girdles and loaned them out, usually to women of high status. But what I particularly love is, firstly, it's a very beautiful thing that was with women in very extreme moments of their lives, obviously. But again, in terms of the exhibition, I'm sure you will notice this, but it sits next to a 13th century manual on women's cosmetics, with recipes from everything from hair scent to breath freshener to be put under the tongue before sexual intercourse. And I feel that maybe if they hadn't used that, we wouldn't need the birth girdle. You can, of course, bring those recipes, the scents, to life, and that's one of the interactive parts of the exhibition. This is a treasure from the British Library's collection. It comes from Lincolnshire around 1325 to 1340. And there's a beautiful essay written by Ellie in the book, which brings to life August in this rural Lincolnshire village. Everybody in the village is up, working together for the most important moment of the agricultural year, which is, of course, bringing in the harvest. Now, why this matters so much, this Luttrell Psalter, and it was painted by an anonymous artist for Sir Geoffrey Luttrell, who was the Lord of Irnham, is that often when you go into history, all periods of history, all cultures, all parts of the world, you hear time and time again, but women didn't, ... But again, that is because of how the history is written and who has written the history. When you go back to original documents, you often find the lie to those general statements, and so it is with the Luttrell Psalter. Because as well as, obviously, you know, the more religious elements of any kind of psalter and extraordinary and wild and wacky illustrations at the side, there are many, many pages that illustrate the harvest coming in. And what do we see there? We see women reaping, carrying short sickles, walking through a sea of barley. We see the women seizing a handful and bringing the blades and then leaving the discarded sheaf for the men following behind. We see a woman standing and stretching her back, just getting rid of the pain of the muscles from the hard work. And you see, and the whole psalter tells you the story of arable farming, really, from ploughing the soil to taking away the crop on a very heavily overloaded cart. And we see women carrying vessels, and the clothing leaves no doubt that they are women. So often when you read about this period, you have the impression that women didn't do any of these tasks, but here we have the evidence that they did. There's also a book of Psalms contained within it, which is beautiful, but obviously there are only certain pages on display. And of course, the majority of the people in rural England at this period of history, in the 14th century, worked on the land. And this is the moment that you are seeing a shift from the feudal economy, where unfree serfs have to work on their lord's land in return for their right to live there, to a wage-based economy. And so we see this as a partner with the Stebbing roll account, which is a little bit later, 1483 to 4. And this is, ladies and gentlemen, which is evidence of a 15th century pay gap, gender pay gap. So this is a list from a particular place, Stebbing Manor, and it records the labourers' wages for the year 1483 to 84. And it's interesting in many ways, not least of all to see how the wages double or treble during the harvest, and also what labourers could expect, so they would be given food as well. But what is particularly extraordinary, and one of those things that again proves that women were doing all of these tasks alongside men, is that there is a list on the Stebbing roll account of 27 men, and they are paid at a daily rate of 4p. There are also 16 women, and they are paid at a daily rate of 3p. And of course, some of the women are only referred to as, John Hassler's wife or Richard Botman's wife. So they don't even exist in their own right. But there we have the gender pay gap, and we still haven't, I'm afraid to say, quite eradicated that one. Now, Christine de Pizan is one of the great legends of medieval writing. She was a French-Italian author, although she probably would have called herself a compiler rather than an author. And she is one of many firsts in terms of women's history in the exhibition. She is considered the first woman in Europe to make her living solely as a writer, so good on her. She was born in 1364, she died in 1430. And she began writing professionally when she was about 25, when her husband died, leaving her with young children. So what's a woman going to do? Now, she's an early feminist. You couldn't use the word. That term won't come into use for maybe 400 years. But she had very strong views that she was not afraid to share about the ways in which men curtailed women's lives, blamed them, diminished them, limited their possibilities, and underestimated their contribution to society and to the world. Now, this one is the Book of the Queen, but earlier books include the Book of the City of Ladies, where she brings together famous women from history to build her allegorical metaphorical city with books, supporting her argument of the contribution that women make to society. Any of you know the great play by Carol Churchill, Top Girls? This is kind of like a 15th century Top Girls. And then it follows with The Treasure of the City of Ladies, and they are partly glorious, not just because of the text, but because of the beauty of the illustrations. They are bright and vivid. And de Pizan herself appears in many of them, as she does here in the Book of the Queen. And she's quite often dressed in her blue dress and a white, wired, horned kind of headdress, as she is here. Now, what's in the exhibition is this, the Book of the Queen. And this is a collection of de Pizan's works put together under her direction and presented to the Queen of France, Isabeau of Bavaria, in 1414. And also because of her and her work, we know another thing that we are told is women weren't illustrators, only men could do that. But she talks about her illustrator, she talks about the contribution made. So again, it's just another way of shining a spotlight on a slightly broader canvas of history. She also wrote something that is very significant, called La Ditty de Jeanne d'Arc in 1429, the song or the ditty of Joan of Arc. And apart from records of Joan of Arc's trial in 1431, it is the only contemporaneous record of La Pucelle, the woman that we know as Joan of Arc. And this is the joy of this exhibition. Medieval women, in their own words, talking about other women who walked alongside them and protecting their voices for history. And so, of course, this brings us to not the highlight of the exhibition, because everything is, but certainly one of the most extraordinary things in the exhibition. And I'm sure any of you who have been in have already looked at it. So last week, in a special case, in a special vehicle that was controlled for temperature and humidity and all of those things, left the city of Riom in the middle of France, carrying this letter. There are 5 letters from Joan of Arc to particular towns. Only 2 of them are signed. This is one of them. And it's written to the citizens of Riom on the 9th of November, 1429. So you will remember that the siege of Orléans was May 1429. And she had become a legend almost overnight. She had arrived with her troops. She was told Charles VII that she was going to help save him, and the English troops far outnumbered them, and the English troops were working with the Burgundians. And of course, this is the 100 Years' War, and they won. The siege was lifted. And so she became almost overnight a legend. And she was still at Charles VII's side, and she was therefore writing to different towns to say, give me gunpowder, give us men. And we know that she couldn't read or write, so these letters will have been dictated. But what is so extraordinary and so moving about this is, if you can see here, and maybe you've seen it in the exhibition, is that Joan of Arc understood the power of words. She understood the power of her writing her own name. So she learnt to do that, even though she couldn't actually read or write. And I find it incredibly moving to see how hard that was. The letters are smudged. There's possibly one too many ends in it, but she did it. Now, this letter has never before left the town of Riom, let alone left France. But because this is the British Library, they said yes. So it came all the way up France, and overnight it is guarded, and then it was brought to the British Library, arriving at 9 o'clock, having left midday the day before in France. And I was privileged to be allowed to be there to watch it being put into the exhibition. I have never had that experience in my life before. And it is extraordinary, the care. It was like being in, not that I've had this either, being in an operating theatre, the way in which this priceless and extraordinary document, so rare. I mean, there is nothing like this, really, was put and brought and treated like the baby that has just been born. Extraordinary. What we know is that the letter was received in Riom, and they presumably read it, but they then put it in their archive and forgot about it. We don't even know if they gave her gunpowder and men to fight. It had a red seal in the shape of a cross and a piece of Joan of Arc's hair, black hair, in the seal. The letter was forgotten until 1844, when somebody found it. And somewhere along the line, the hair disappeared. And there are many scientists, the Courier was telling us in the 1990s in particular, there were scientists desperately trying to find it, because can you imagine if you could get some kind of DNA from Joan of Arc, but it's never been found. What we do know is that Joan of Arc, of course, had a very brief moment of being supported. She continued to fight, and the war continued, but she was finally captured in May 1430, and the bishops demanded that she should be tried as a heretic, not as a soldier. And by January 1431, she was in the hands of the bishops, and there was a show trial. There was no possibility of her being acquitted. All of the visions that had seemed so powerful, she had had visions since the age of about 13. Everything was turned against her. She acquitted herself extraordinarily well with theological arguments, but she was never going to be let go. And they were as vexed in some ways by the fact that she wore men's clothing as they were by the fact that she claimed to have a direct line, as it were, to God. And after a very complicated moment of recanting and changing and going back, she was burnt at the stake on the 3rd of May, 1431. Charles VII did nothing to save her, but when he did win, he had her sentence revoked and annulled in 1456. And she is almost unique in history, for men or women, in that she became a legend almost straight away. She was finally, of course, beatified in 1909. She was declared a saint in 1920. And 2 years later, she was declared a patron saint of France. And she is one of those people that speaks beyond time, beyond place, beyond gender, beyond everything. When you research, and in my book, Warrior Queens and Quiet Revolution, which is putting 1,000 women back into history, almost every culture in the world has their version that is explained by the shorthand, Joan of Arc. There is a Congolese Joan of Arc. There is an Armenian Joan of Arc. There is a Russian Joan of Arc. There is a Vietnamese Joan of Arc. Now, of course, this is wrong because they are all themselves and they should be celebrated for that. But the fact that it means something and it's clear is testimony to quite how powerfully she captures the imagination. And the strangeness that she is a symbol for everybody, for the far right, for the Catholic Church, for feminists, for everybody. And I think that is one of the reasons this letter is so moving, because she ceased to be a person almost straight away. But when we look at this letter and we know that she held it in her hands and she sealed it with a piece of her own hair, that's when you see the teenage girl who thought it was her role to save France. And that is what this exhibition does as well. It puts the real flesh and blood women back in front of the legends and the storytelling and the mythologizing that follows. A different kind of, I've just skipped. The Book of Margery Kempe is, many of you will know about Margery Kempe. She's another first. It's considered the first autobiography written in English. She was a visionary and a mystic. She lived in Norfolk. She's around, this is around 1445 to 1450. She's very unusual, though, as a mystic. Joan of Arc was herself, and she was known as La Pucelle, and she was known as the Maid of Orléans, and this was very much a part of her mythologizing. Whereas Kemp was actually married. She had at least 14 children, and she was neither a nun nor an abbess. And the book of Margery Kemp, she couldn't read or write, but she dictated it to several scribes in the 1430s, and she speaks of herself in the third person. Now, she was arrested many times for the heresy of Lollardy, and the Lollards were followers, as I'm sure you know, of John Wycliffe, and they tried to live a life of contemplation and poverty. And what became very much the part of Margery Kemp, the book of Margery Kemp, that people focused upon was, of course, her religious experiences, her visions. And in another wonderful interactive part of the exhibition, she talked about the visions and how heaven would be. And you can open a box and smell how Margery Kemp thought heaven smelt. You can also actually, Julian of Norwich, how she thought hell smelt. And that is a much less pleasant experience. But this is the only, it's held by the British Library, and this is the only surviving manuscript of her book that we know of. And what is wonderful is there were many references to it, and it's a very powerful text. Sometimes the domestic details that she talks about, which give an incredible insight into a woman's life of this period of history, get forgotten in the focus on the visionary and the religious iconography. But what I love was that this book was lost. And it was finally found in an English country house in 1934, just in the back of a cupboard. And what I love about these stories is just imagine how many other treasures are out there. So when you go home, will you please look at the back of your cupboard? Very quickly, another first, the first Valentine's letter. What about that? February 1477, a woman called Marjorie Bruce writing to her suitor, John Paston III, and she calls him her right beloved Valentine. And it's a joyous letter because it is clear that she loves him hugely, but she fears for him. She's worried the marriage won't go ahead. It's very personal. She talks about the fact she doesn't feel very well and asks him not to show the letter to any other earthly creature. And she could be us, couldn't she, writing that first Valentine's card or a private message to somebody you're rather keen on, you don't want anybody else to see it. And of course, as we know, marriage was very rarely a question of love. It was about alliances. And her father, Sir Thomas Bruce, was a landowner in his own right. The Pastons were very much up-and-coming Norfolk aristocracy, but they didn't think the dowry was big enough. So it looked like the marriage might not go ahead. But Marjorie's mother saved the day, acted as a go-between, and an invitation was issued to John to come and stay on Valentine's Day. And 2 months later, they were married. And this is part of the collection of Paston letters, which is a wonderful collection of over many generations of the Paston family. And it gives us insight, because one of the reasons that women's voices disappear so much is that so much of history has been written about the tiny percentage of people at the top of society, as it were, whereas the Paston letters, as many of the other things in the exhibition, are about women's lives, actually how women lived their lives, and that's why the testimony matters. Colophon of Estelina Conat, we're not quite sure how her name would be pronounced, but it seems appropriate at the British Library to come to nearly to the end with a woman who made books. Some of the earliest books printed in Europe, of course, are in Hebrew, and they most, huge centres of printing in Italy, but also in Spain, in Portugal, in Constantinople. And printing workshops did tend to be a family business, but often women's contributions to that are not recorded. It's just the name of the man. But she, Estelina Conat, is one exception. And her printing of The Examination of the World is an almost completely unprecedented testimony of the lives of Jewish women's contributions. And she is the first known female Hebrew printer, or typesetter, possibly is more accurate, and certainly one of the first known female printers in any language. And it says on the colophon on her page, it says, "I, Estelina, the wife of my worthy husband, Abraham Conant, wrote this book, Behinat Olam, with the help of Jacob Levy of Tarascon." Now, because half of us are witches, because night is young, I have to finish with this. I'm not going to read it, obviously, because it is very saucy indeed. But this is an extraordinary Welsh poem called Gwerfyl Mesiang, and she died somewhere around 1502. We're not entirely. And I fear to say this line out loud, but given what we're talking about, but the poem was transmitted orally, not written down for many generations. Anyway, but there are 19 poems, but it's the biggest oeuvre of any Welsh female poet. And it's very important because there was absolutely an idea that there were no women writing poetry in Wales at this particular moment. And indeed, these poems were attributed to male authors for some time and only more recently have been attributed to her. There are 19 poems that survived. They are devotional, but they're also erotic, and they are very explicit. And they are very funny because they are mocking many of the male poets who only talk about how beautiful a woman's face is, but don't look down below. And they are dignified, I would say. They are very, very bawdy. And it's important to say that they probably wouldn't have seemed so shocking to contemporary listeners as they maybe did in subsequent centuries. But they are about women's lives. They're about the way women talk to each other. It is an extraordinary example of women's desire, when often, again, the narrative was that women didn't have desire, and if they did have desire, that was because they were wicked and they were being possessed by devils. And so I did feel that it was very appropriate to finish to the poem to the vagina, because we are here celebrating women in all their glory, and the medieval women from the past that we, I suppose, well, they're us, aren't they? That's the point about this exhibition. Of course, everything that happens in different places, in different times, is about the context. It's about expectation. Are women's lives the same all over the world today in different countries? No, they're not. We live in a world where women are still shot for going to school, and girls. We live in a world where women are not now, as of 2 days ago, allowed to speak to other women in Afghanistan. So this is not just about celebrating the voices of the past. It's understanding that history is a pendulum, that it swings backwards and it swings forwards. It's about understanding that women's lives do not follow in a linear pattern to some glorious uplands where all will be equal and fair. Because every wonderful man, woman, anybody, however you think of yourselves, most people believe that people should be judged for what they do and they say, not what they look like or who they're related to or where they come from. But things go well and they go backwards. And exhibitions like this that tell us the journey that we have come on and tell us the realities of women's lives, some of which is completely alien to us and some of which is completely familiar and relatable, reminds us that everything that we have because somebody has raised their voice. Somebody has lifted up a pen and written down what mattered, written down something that feels true. So when you are enjoying the exhibition, remember that a woman writing is still a political act, now as it was then. And remember, as the great Margaret Atwood said, a word after a word after a word is power. Thank you. Right. Thank you. Thank you. No. Now, we've got time for just a couple of questions, and I know we've got some online questions. So if anybody wants to ask anything, throw your hand in the air. Bee's got a microphone. If it's about the exhibition that I can't answer, Ellie has said she will very kindly answer anything. So does anybody have a question? Lady there, thank you.
Where can I read a translation?
Can you do a mic, please? So the online audience.
Where Where can I read a translation of the Welsh poem about the vagina?
And I like the fact that the gentleman sitting next to you is looking quite keen about this. Yes, very keen. There actually are quite a lot of translations available simply online because she's become quite a focus for feminist poets and reanalysis because of her work being attributed to male poets for quite a long time. So when I was just reading this, I just brought them up online, so they're easy to find. Yeah. Lady there in pink. This is when everybody who works at the British Library gets their steps in. Yeah.
Thank you very much for a wonderful talk. It was when I was at the exhibition at the weekend, I noticed a lot of information came from Norfolk area, east of England, that kind of region. Is there a reason? Are they just particularly good at minding everything? Or
I don't know. Ellie, is that just how it goes? In terms of families preserving things? Because I think they're mostly families in there, aren't they?
Yeah, I think it's partly also to do with the fact that East Anglia was very wealthy in the Middle Ages because of the wool trade and also because of trade in the North Sea. It was a very, very wealthy area, so, places like King's Lynn and Norwich were extraordinary rich towns, so there was a lot of culture coming from that area as a result.
Lovely, thank you. Thank you. Anybody else? Lady there?
Thank you. It's lovely to see you again, Kate, since the Women's Prize. I was just wondering if you yourself had looked any further back. You mentioned, obviously, that there were women, the equivalent of women priests within the Cathar Perfect. Have you looked further back? Because that's how I ended up with you, was that I went from Sister Fidelma and the Peter Tremaine books and researched a bit about the Brehons into finding out about the Cathar Perfect, which then led me to Labyrinth. So have you looked further back as well? Because they had very leading positions before. This was the Church of Columba, before the Roman Church became the major driver.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. I mean, I think for me, the key was realising that at every moment there are hinge points in history. And so when you look at early Christianity, it's a much more Gnostic religion. And men and women are much more, not equal, but they are certainly participating in similar ways. Whereas the moment at which you look at the books, I'm assuming everyone here knows the Bible is a collection of writings. There isn't one author. Dare I say that? Disaster. But there were other books that might have been included, shall we say, and were not. And so the leaving out of women's writings at that moment, and also the Council of Nicaea, which made a decision about, locked it, as it were. And then you start to see women being seen as less, and I hesitate to use the word pure, but certainly the idea that they can't be priests, and the idea that because of the disciples were all men, therefore that was what would be intended in the church going forward. And of course, the reason that I became very interested in all of this was my aunt was one of the women who founded the movement for the ordination of women in the UK. She was a wonderful woman called Margaret Booker, and she was in the second batch of women to be ordained in April 1994. The first batch were in Bristol Cathedral in March 1994. And that was so recent. So for me, it was learning firstly about the Cathars, that there were parfaits as well as parfaits. There weren't thousands of them. I mean, again, it's very important to not overstate it, but they were there. And then going back into the early Christianity in Gaul in particular, in sort of the second and third centuries, and seeing it was just a much more esoteric Christianity, if you like. So I am very interested in those earlier beginnings, yeah. Thank you. Lady there, thank you.
Thank you, that was a wonderful talk. and the wonderful exhibition. My question is, do you think exhibitions like this will perhaps help people redefine what the Renaissance was? Because when I was in school, 19th century German historians explained that it was men in Florence who rediscovered one-point perspective, and that kind of kicked in the Renaissance. And now we're learning that maybe that's kind of a narrow view of what was happening in the 15th century. And I'm thinking of writers like Christine de Pizan and Joan of Arc, and they certainly seem as revolutionary as Brunelleschi with his one-point perspective. And I just was wondering if you had an opinion on that.
Yes, I think this exhibition is not only beautiful and very timely, but really important, because people sometimes get concerned about the idea of revising history, but it's almost never that. It is about expanding history. And when I was setting up the Women's Prize, I was trying to explain to my wonderful dad, who was very much an English gent of a certain type and a certain age. He was born in 1924, and he was old-fashioned in many, many ways. But I was explaining that it was about amplifying, honouring and celebrating women's voices. It wasn't about taking men out of the equation. It was this. And my dad just looked at me and he said, "Oh, I understand, darling. It's just about getting a bigger table and more chairs." And I think that is the goal for me as a historian monkey. You know, I'm not a historian. I'm a novelist who is inspired by history. It's about telling the whole story and honouring and acknowledging everybody who made a contribution. And we know what happens in history is that there is the black swan. So the idea that, well, no women did this. Oh, there is one, but she was exceptional. Or that women never did any of this. We'd go, well, here we go. It's very easy to write all sorts of groups of people out of history, but obviously my project has always been writing women back in. And I think when you have an exhibition like this that challenges so many preconceptions, that it then makes everybody who comes through these doors think, oh, so if that's not quite true, what about this? It's like pulling a piece of thread. The minute you start to pull, the whole jumper unravels. I don't know why I use a knitting metaphor. I've never knitted anything in my life, but I can imagine it like that. So that's why I think it matters. It helps all of us to be slightly more inquisitive about why one story is being told and another one is not. Thank you. Is there anybody, last question maybe? Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is more about the exhibition. I was interested, there was quite a significant percentage of items about Jewish people and the Jewish ladies and community, but they must have been a small minority within the English population. I'm saying English rather than European or Scottish, whatever. So is it that the Jewish communities had a way of storing their information, or was it just that the women in the families were honoured more so that they were preserved better? Why is there such a larger quantity of Jewish female literature or items?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Do you know the answer to that, Ellie?
Well, I'm not sure that there is. I mean, when researching the exhibition, it was quite difficult to find things because, as you say, there was such a history of persecuting the Jews in Europe in the Middle Ages that so much has been lost. I mean, particularly from England, where the Jews were expelled in the 13th century. Trying to recover the history of Jewish women in England was very challenging. So, yeah, the things that there are in the exhibition were kind of things we really sought to find to make sure that we included those women in the picture.
Lovely.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's interesting that and maybe you're right, it feels significant because one of the things is, being constantly told that Jewish girls were not taught to read. And there's an extraordinary poet, Italian Jewish poet called Rachel Lozzato Mapurgo. She's not in the exhibition, obviously, she's later. And she published poetry under her own name. and was considered to be the first woman to write in Hebrew for 1,000 years. And in my book, Warrior Queens and Quiet Revolutionaries, I repeat that. And then I come to this exhibition and I think, well, hang on a second. This is a woman writing in Hebrew well within that time frame. So, we are all learning and revising all of the time. Thank you. Right, is that it, B, I think?
Your last chance.
Last chance.
Okay, but you have a chance to get your book signed by Kate Mosse and to buy a CD by Kate Arnold. But meanwhile, for now, please join me in giving them a huge thanks for such a lovely